So good to have you join us today. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Lee Ji-eun in Seoul. Coming up on today's edition of Business Daily. Will things start looking up for Korea's consumer sentiment after the May 9th presidential election? We'll sit down with an expert to talk about this. With a rapidly aging society, Korea's market for senior-friendly food is also growing by the day. These stories and more coming right up. Consumers look a little more ready to open their wallets again. Their confidence in the economy has been on the rise over the last 3 months on the back of stronger export numbers and anticipation of greater stability on the political front. Our Oh Soo-young starts us off.
More consumers are feeling upbeat about the Korean economy. The Bank of Korea's monthly index shows consumer sentiment hit 101.2 in April, climbing over 4 points on month and surpassing the psychologically important benchmark of 100. Any reading above 100 means there are more optimists than pessimists. All 6 categories in the composite index, including current living conditions, expected standards of living, future income and prospective domestic economic conditions, inched up from the month before. The central bank attributes the turnaround to the recent uptick in exports, which hit a 2-year high last month, amounting to some $48.9 billion. Exports have seen steady growth since November last year, thanks to strong demand for key industrial products such as semiconductors, displays and steel products. Also, experts believe consumer sentiment has been further boosted by the easing of political uncertainties as the May 9th presidential election draws closer. But will the upward trend in sentiment lead to a recovery in consumption?
We will have to wait and see if consumer sentiment continues to rise in the coming months. The lingering structural problems related to aging, work, housing, and household debt aren't expected to be resolved anytime soon. And these factors limit significant growth in income. So these structural problems must be addressed through policies in order to improve consumption and boost consumer sentiment.
Still, the expert expects economic growth to pick up in the months following, largely driven by increased exports and investment, as the global economy is expected to fare better this year. Korea's finance minister said this weekend that GDP growth this year may exceed the current estimate of 2.6%. Oh Soo-young, Business Daily.
And to tell us more about this, Professor Yang Jun-suk from the Catholic University of Korea joins us in the studio today. So good to see you.
Happy to be here.
So Korea's exports have rebounded in recent months, and there are growing expectations that the economy might be on a recovery track. Then can we expect this consumer sentiment to rebound as the economy gets better?
Okay, well, the OECD reported the international comparison between consumer sentiments just a few days ago, and they were using February numbers, and Korean numbers were very dark. They were ranked very low among OECD countries. And number was below 100, which means that they were very pessimistic. But the Bank of Korea just announced April numbers, and April numbers are actually fairly optimistic. It went up to 101.2. Now the Consumer Confidence Index is a number of they ask households various questions on the past and present. Are they better off than they were 6 months ago in various areas? And then they ask future expectations. What do they expect 6 months from now? And the Consumer Confidence Index is a weighted average of those answers from those questions.
Okay.
And just 2 months ago, they were pessimistic, but now they're optimistic. So that's obviously a good sign. But if you go into the sub-components of those numbers, the interesting thing is, if you look at their present situation, then they're still a bit pessimistic. Most of the respondents say that they were worse off now than they were 6 months ago. But if their expectation for what would happen 6 months from now is very optimistic.
And also just yesterday, we reported that Koreans are hit with a double whammy as prices surge and unemployment also been hitting record high levels. Tell us more about this.
Okay, well, there's a so-called the Consumer Pain Index, which is a simple sum of unemployment index and the inflation rate. And the unemployment rate is 4.3%, and CPI inflation is 2.1%. So the sum is 6.4%, and people who keep track of these things say that this is the highest it's been since in about 5 years.
Oh, wow.
There is a lot of pain out there. Youth unemployment is even higher at 11% range. But you should always take these things with a grain of salt because, well, 2.1% inflation is not very high, and it's actually below Bank of Korea's target inflation rate. I think what this pain index shows us is that we're at sort of a very critical phase where things can go both ways. It could just go back into a recession, or if we can keep the hope alive, then we could spark a better economy.
And also, there are a lot of socio-psychological factors involved when it comes to determining the health of our economy. So when taking that into account, the Korean economy seems to be faced with a number of problems.
Okay, well, there's a lot of political uncertainty. Hopefully, when the elections are over, a lot of those uncertainty will disappear. There's also some problems in the international environment. There's growing protectionism. There's growing isolationism, which may be even a bigger problem in Europe, in the United States especially. And then there's domestic sentiment. Korea's never had a recession that was this long. I think people are perhaps more pessimistic than they were in the past, just because we've never faced a recession this long before. I think supplementary budget is necessary because gains from exports is going to be very uneven, at least for the first few months.
Right.
And it's very important to keep the people's hope alive. Supplementary budget to bring on board the people who may be excluded from recovery into recovery, maybe just the thing that's needed to help everybody keep their consumption optimism alive.
Now, another important event coming up is the May 9th presidential election. So what kind of impact does a presidential election have on consumer sentiment? Okay,
well, usually whenever you have a presidential election, you have a rise in consumer sentiment because they're more hopeful for the future. And then you also have perhaps an overheated economy because, well, frankly, there's a lot of money being spent on these campaigns.
Right.
So in the past, whenever there was an election, there were actually a lot of concerns that perhaps inflation would get high, perhaps the economy would overheat. This election, however, that does not seem to be so. People are still optimistic, but this time you don't see that overheating effect as much as you saw in the past election. Partially that may be because the recession has gone on for so long. Partially, I think because the campaign is so short. You didn't really want to campaign actively during the impeachment phase.
Right.
So now the impeachment is over, so people are just starting to campaign. But even there, they're limited by things like the anti-corruption law, the so-called Kim Young-nan law, where they cannot afford to give too many gifts or do too many flashy activities. So I think that's also keeping the spending down somewhat in this election. Also, the compressed nature of this election is also perhaps keeping the spending low. So we don't see as much of an expansionary effect, overheating effect, as we did in the previous elections.
All right, then what's your outlook on consumer sentiment from here on out, and what are some of the factors that we should keep our close eyes on? Okay,
well, as I mentioned before, if you look at the present and past changes in present, then the numbers are actually not very good. But if you look at the hopes for the future, then it is very good. It depends on things like whether the current expansion in exports will continue. It will depend on things like whether the unemployment rate will hold steady. It maybe even improve, hopefully. It'll also depend on whether the government is optimistic about the future. As I said before, I think supplementary budget, we can talk about the scale of it, but having a supplementary budget will really help because then people will know that not only will they have growth in exports, but they'll also have increased government expenditure to count on. And then we should also talk about the social safety net, especially because this is an election period. But partially the reason why consumers are so pessimistic and they're not spending so much is that they're worried about retirement. partially it's because the interest rate is so low right now that they have to save a lot in order to get the same amount that they were counting on in the past when the interest rate was high. So perhaps more discussion about social safety net, especially for what would happen for the retirees, would help the consumers relax, worry less about the future, and spend more now.
All right, thank you so much for your insight today, Professor.
Thank you.
SK Hynix, the world's second largest memory chip maker, saw its earnings jump to a record high in the first quarter on the back of rising chip prices. The firm said its operating profits during the January to March period came to roughly $2.17 billion. This represents a whopping 339% surge from last year. The record performance was attributed to a supply crunch in the market coupled with high demand, which has led to a global spike in the price of memory chips. The chipmaker also posted record revenue, which saw 72% growth on year. Very cautiously optimistic. This was Finance Minister Yoo Il-ho's assessment of the Korean economy in relation to Washington's trade policy. Speaking with CNBC on Tuesday, Yoo said U.S. President Donald Trump's stance on trade is cause for much concern to Korea and said Seoul is working to reduce its trade surplus with the United States. In terms of geopolitical risks stemming from North Korea, Yoo said although the threats are real, they will have little actual impact on the South Korean economy, given that the two Koreas have been living under such conditions for 7 decades. Starting today, overseas Koreans who have registered to vote will be able to cast their ballots in the May 9th presidential election. Polling stations will be open in 116 countries around the world until April 30th. And with that, major candidates have highlighted their specific pledges that appeal to Koreans living abroad. Our Ji Myung-gil has the details.
Democratic Party of Korea candidate Moon Jae-in has vowed to set up an agency for overseas Koreans under either the Interior or the Foreign Ministry. The agency would expand financial support to Korean schools abroad and strengthen the global network of Korean nationals. Moon also promised to set up extra diplomatic offices around the world in locations frequented by Korean tourists. Liberty Korea's Hong Jung-pyo has plans for a similar agency that will be set up under the Prime Minister's office. The agency would provide overseas Koreans with educational support, foster exchange projects, and supervise overseas voting procedures. Hong also promised to build a museum dedicated to overseas Koreans. The People's Party's An Cheol-soo wants to establish a presidential committee for overseas Koreans and pledged financial support to Korean students studying abroad to help with their tuition. He also said he would expand the rights of Koreans who have permanent residency abroad, for example by increasing the number of polling booths and introducing a vote-by-mail system. On the security front, An promised to beef up protections for Koreans living abroad. The Pareum Party's Yoo Seung-min says he will keep the Overseas Koreans Foundation under the Foreign Ministry. He promised to boost pride in the Korean identity among overseas Koreans and revitalize cultural exchanges. He also vowed to improve consular services and diplomatic protections for overseas Koreans. The Justice Party Sim Sang-jung promised to set up an independent agency for overseas Koreans that would provide legal aid to overseas Koreans and Koreans traveling abroad. She also said she would consider expanding the number of countries eligible for dual citizenship, for applicants who pay taxes in Korea and for men who complete their mandatory military service. A record number, 294,000 overseas Koreans, are expected to vote in the presidential election this year. Ji Myung-gil, Business Daily.
The May extended holiday is just around the corner, a period that Korea's tourism industry looks forward to, as it usually benefits from a boost in visitors from neighboring countries. But industry watchers worry that this year might be different, following the recent drop in travelers, particularly from China and Japan. According to the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, the number of Chinese visitors in March dropped nearly 40% from a year ago, after Beijing imposed a series of economic retaliations against Seoul's deployment of THAAD. Escalating tensions on the Korean peninsula are not helping either when it comes to attracting tourists from Japan. The ministry says growth in Japanese visitors slid to 2 to 3% from a strong trend of over 20% growth seen earlier this month, after more reports surfaced about inter-Korean tensions. The government is considering instituting penalties for local governments and their rice producers who exceed their yearly production allotments. In a bid to shrink the size of public rice reserves during periods of surplus, the government has designated annual production targets based on city and province. The Agriculture Ministry is considering penalizing local governments that exceed these limits by reducing their quota in the following year. To regulate the rice market and keep prices stable, the Korean government has traditionally purchased rice in times of surplus. Since 2005, the government has bought about 340,000 to 360,000 tons of rice each year. The government is also looking to offer incentives for times of rice underproduction. The Agriculture Ministry will finalize these plans and release them in September. A new study shows that in less than 30 years, elderly people living alone will exceed the 3 million mark, quadrupling from figures today. This as the single-person household demographic is set to become the largest by 2045. Our Eunice Kim has more.
An advertisement for a telecommunications company. It shows a grandmother living alone, and as her internet-connected device alerts her caretaker, she runs to make sure the grandmother is all right. Single-person households are poised to become the largest demographic, and the biggest portion of that group is said to be the elderly. A report by Statistics Korea shows while there were less than 900,000 Koreans 70 years and older in 2015, that number is forecast to quadruple, to exceed 3 million 3 decades later by 2045. In fact, it's projected more than 8 million people will live alone, accounting for the largest chunk of household sizes, followed by 2- and 3-person family units. Those in their 70s, 80s, and older are estimated to make up 39% of that demographic, becoming the most common family unit in Korean society within 28 years.
We are already seeing a lot of elderly couples living apart from their children, and when one of them passes away, they live alone.
It's not a happy trend either, economically speaking. Another report shows that those in the top fifth in terms of income didn't see much change over 13 years, but those in the bottom fifth, the poorest group, expanded by 20 percentage points in the period from 2003 through last year.
Providing quality jobs for the elderly will be needed. We'll need to step up efforts to provide training for them so they can work and subsist on their own.
And as the demographic grows in sheer numbers, the government, both at the local and state levels, will need to grapple with how to best prepare for a Korea that's both aging and increasingly living alone. Eunice Kim, Business Daily.
And as more elderly people are expected to live alone, another key concern has become how to provide the right kind of food to improve their quality of life while catering to their changing tastes. Our Lee Ju-young has the story.
It's dinner time, and at 90-year-old Lee Chun-ho's house, some of his favorite dishes are being prepared. They're mostly soft and easy to digest, like fish, duck, and soybean paste soup. He says now, eating instant products is something he has trouble doing.
They're made for young people, so they're not fit for us. In my case, I tend to avoid them because I start having trouble with digestion. I can't really eat hard food like meat either because of my teeth. Just 2 to 3 years ago, I used to even drink some alcohol and coffee. But I think as I age more, everything, including my tastes, are changing.
Yi is just one of Korea's 6.9 million seniors aged 65 and above, which is about 70,000 more than the number of children aged below 14 as of the end of last year. And with these elders projected to take up about 14% of the total population by the end of this year, senior-friendly food, specifically made to ease their eating problems and improve their quality of life, has become a must.
With the regular diet, they're not able to get the right nutritional balance. Particularly for those with swallowing problems, the number one cause of death at hospitals is pneumonia. That's because even when they drink water, it may go down their airway. These are all the reasons why we need senior-friendly food as a solution.
One country that's arguably the most developed in terms of the senior-friendly food industry is Japan. After roughly 20 years of research and development, the government came up with a system of food labeling that classifies products into 4 different groups based on their hardness and stickiness so that elderly consumers can pick and choose depending on how well they can chew or swallow. In Korea, though, it's only now that related bills are being proposed, with the proportion of these senior-friendly foods only making up about 1.5% of the total domestic market. But its growth potential is considered to be huge, having surged nearly 55% over 4 years and reaching $697 million in 2015. This is why large companies are actively investing in health functional foods. In the case of Korea Ginseng Corporation, it has a specific brand called Cheonnok, and its products are said to help relieve fatigue and quickly restore energy. The ginseng company says over $44 million worth of Cheonnok products were purchased over the past 2 years, mainly by Koreans in their 50s and 60s.
It's become pretty clear that seniors are now taking better care of their health, since they don't like to depend on their children or anybody else. That's why we released this Cheonnok line with people in their 50s and 60s in mind. Also, given the strong performance in sales we've seen, we believe the market will expand even further.
Apart from many large companies that are now actively expanding their presence in the health functional food market, social enterprise Well Union makes packaged meals called hyoban, being the only company in Korea that specifically caters to seniors with chewing and swallowing issues.
Just talking about it doesn't make a difference. There needs to be an alternative. So I thought we could make food that safely goes down the throat and not the airway. In Europe or Japan, these foods usually take the form of jelly or pudding. But food also needs to go with the culture. If we were to give our elderly jelly or pudding, they wouldn't think of it as a meal. So we decided to add viscosity to congee so that it only goes down the throat and not down the respiratory tract.
Being low in salt and full of vitamins and minerals that help with metabolism, this konjijuk comes in about 20 different flavors and is currently being distributed to about 10 senior care centers around Seoul and the surrounding area every day. Well Union was recognized for its excellence as a social enterprise by the Seoul Metropolitan Government in 2016 and says its ultimate goal is to set up a systemized nutritional care network for seniors. It also sells its products at its own restaurant built for the same purpose, offering meals at half price for people aged 65 years or older. Experts say despite this being an industry with massive potential, major food companies remain cautious as they associate it with risks due to the sensitive nature of their target consumers.
In order to make food for the elderly, a system should be introduced that attracts more firms that want to invest. That being said, I think the government needs to support policies that are promotional by nature, not regulatory.
They also add that companies need to acknowledge Korea's rapidly growing population as a major social problem and strive to make social contributions that can provide more support for those in need. Lee Ju-young, Business Daily.
And that wraps it up for today. Thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time, same place for your Business Daily. Until then, goodbye.